Alrighty, it's now finally time for us to talk about loops. There are a number of types of loops out there in the world, and I've got a couple of them set up for us right here, available to look at and try out. We've actually got 4 different types of loops. There are actually 2 types of loops with 2 variants each. You've got a while loop, a do-while loop, a for loop, and a for-in loop. And before we get too far into this, let me just explain what a loop is. A loop is a bit of code that is going to run maybe. Basically, the way it works is you've got a little bit of code that's going to run maybe. And when I say that it's going to run maybe, what I'm talking about is you have some code that requires something called a comparison. And we've actually done a comparison before whenever we did our ternary options, and also whenever we did our if and else statements. The comparison that all of these loops are requiring is similar to the if statement. It's basically asking, is something true? The difference is, whereas the if would activate one set of commands after the comparison was made, the while loop will compare your comparison. It will then evaluate it, and if it's true, it will then do a block of code. But at the end of the block of code, it will go back to the comparison and compare again. This gives you the opportunity to check something until something is false. In other words, to keep pounding against it until finally you break it down and make it false. This is really handy for things like moving through loops, breaking off things until there are none left, and also... no, that's it. That's pretty much it. Moving through arrays and breaking things off until you have no more left is pretty much the standard use of both the while and the for loops. So let's dive into this and see how this works. You can see I've got a couple of loops set up right now on lines 11, 15, 19, and 23 of my code. And you can see that what I've highlighted here is the comparison area of the while loop. And the way this works is that inside of here, what I can basically say is something like true. And while true is true, I can tell JavaScript to do something like console.log it's still true. Of course, the problem with this is that the value of true will always evaluate to true. And so the thing is that this while loop will never end. This is a bad thing, not a good thing. You want your loops to end. You don't want them to go on continuously and forever. And so that's why you want to set in some sort of objective to reach. Now you can do this in a number of ways. But let me just show you an opposite reaction to the while loop, which is if you put false right here. What's interesting is that if you put false inside of the while loop, this will never run, because it will evaluate the comparison right off the top. And if it equals false right at the beginning, then the while loop never runs any of its code. None of it ever gets run. So what that means is we can set up a couple of interesting processes. Right now I'm going to go ahead and comment each of these out just a little bit, and I'll bring them in as I need them. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set myself up a little bit of something that I can work with. And basically the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to make myself an array. Let's say that var colors equals red, green, and blue. Now that I've got an array here, what I can do is I can use one of the methods of this array to continuously do something to the array until I get a false statement from whatever I'm doing. If you remember back to when we first discussed arrays, one of the methods of arrays is the pop method. What that means is I can actually use the pop method to continuously pull off elements of an array until there are none left. And what I can actually do is I can actually set the value of those array pops into a variable right inside of the while comparison. Let me show you what I mean. Inside of this while comparison, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a variable called C. And this variable called C is going to equal colors.pop. And it's going to continue to equal colors.pop as long as colors has elements to pop off. And if you remember, pop is going to pop off the end of the array. What that means is that inside of this console.log, I can log out the value of C until there's no more value left. In other words, until C equals some sort of false value. Actually, I don't think I'm going to be able to define C every single time I loop through this. It might be that what I need to do is define C once outside of the while loop. I think that's going to be a better idea. So I'm going to go back and just define var C outside of the while loop. You'll see why if you ever try it, but basically I don't believe, actually now that I think back on it, you can actually define a varred instance of a C inside of the while loop. You have to do that outside and then just use the C inside of the while comparison. Now let's try out this code. I'm going to go ahead and save this document that I'm calling loops.html, and I'm going to try to run this out in the browser. When I launch it out into Chrome and I open up the Chrome console, I should now see blue, green, red. And the reason that I see blue, green, red is because it popped off the last one first and showed that, and then it popped off the green one and it showed that, and then it popped off the red one and showed that. It turns out that the while loop is a great way to take an array and just show all of the items inside of it one by one if you'd like to. The while loop will continue to run through everything that it's given until finally it hits something that says false. As long as it continues to get values that equal some sort of true value, it will continue to loop and loop and loop through all of the elements, and it could potentially never stop. I think I mentioned earlier that would be a bad thing. You actually want it to stop. But just in case you're wanting to try it out on yourself, I'd like you to go try this out yourself. Go ahead and write up a while loop and also a colors array, and pop each of the elements off one at a time and log them out to the console. And when you're ready, click to continue.